This brief podcast is intended to clarify the expectations for your final assessment task, Assessment Task 3. In Assessment Task 1, you were exploring different applications to produce a professional learning resource. That was something that you could use to teach other teachers about the apps that you were exploring. In this particular assessment task, I want you to consider the sorts of apps that we have taught each other in our classes, or explore other apps. This time, instead of creating a professional learning resource, we want you to create a teaching resource. We want you to use some form of digital technologies applications to create a resource that you could use as a teacher in your classroom. Except it's not your classroom. We're giving you a case study of a school, and within that school, 2 classrooms. You get to choose one of those classrooms. The digital resource that you create needs to be consistent with the philosophies around learning and teaching that are evident in that case study. Now, these may not be explicitly stated to you. They may be philosophies and approaches that you infer from the information that you are being given in that particular case study. So one of the things that we'll be looking for is whether you're being consistent with the sort of pedagogical approaches taken by teachers in your case study school. Now, some of you might be asking, what is a digital teaching resource? That's probably the first question that most of you will have. I've given some examples here about what some resources might look like. In your class, you will have students operating at multiple levels within the same class. When you're planning, you might choose to differentiate what the different ability levels in your class, or what the students of different ability levels in your class will do. So you might create a digital resource that extends the high achieving students. You might create a digital resource that helps to simplify the concepts that your lower level students are struggling with. So there might be a scaffolding resource that you create using some form of digital technologies. You might, in fact, create an incomplete ICT enriched learning experience. This could be something like a problem-based learning scenario where you create, using Google Sites or a Google Doc, some form of problem-based learning scenario where you outline and give background information and then expect the students to solve particular problems. Something that I model with my third year BEd students. You could produce some form of online assessment or online assessment support. I'm not quite sure what that would look like, but have a think. Time to be creative and think about how you might use technology as a way to help you do the teaching that you do. There might be an online podcast or a vodcast to explain a concept, to help students review their learning. This could easily slip into an information transmission pedagogy, which I'm guessing is possibly not consistent with the learning and teaching philosophy of either of the case study schools. So think a little bit about the nature of that podcast and how that might fit with a more student-centred approach. There might be an online game that some of you might create to help learners construct knowledge. What I'm asking you to do here is to be creative, but to think about, how do I move beyond simple substitution to start to modify and reinvent how students can learn in my classroom, and therefore what resources I might produce. Another example, not listed here, could be a stimulus resource, something that you create to introduce and to engage the students. So think a little bit more about, back to Introduction to Educational Settings, where we're talking about being engaging and being inclusive and challenging our students. So have those sorts of concepts in the back of your mind when you're thinking about the sort of resource that you create. So again, here we're talking about deep critical thinking and learning, which is more consistent with the philosophy of learning and teaching in the two case study schools. The case study schools, to remind you, are on the Blackboard website under the assessment task folder. What we're asking you to do is to share your digital and teaching resource with your peers in a blog. So that could be an embedded object, it could be the video, it could be a link to a web-based object. Have a think about how best you're going to include your digital teaching resource in the blog. It could be an image of it if it's a static page. Could be a link to a website. If you're linking to a website that you've created or an app that's a web-based app, you'll need to make sure that other people can see the app. So make sure you share it, make it public, however you need to do that, depending upon the requirements of that particular app. In the blog, you're also expected to use 600 words minimum of showing your theoretical considerations of learner engagement and safe and ethical use of the ICT related to the resource that you created. So I want you to link back to the literature around how you've engaged, why you've chosen this, how this particular app links with ideas about ICT and learning. And the online lectures and suggested readings should provide you with plenty of clues for that part of the assignment. The other part of the assignment, that is all due by the 22nd of October. 22nd of October. But there's a second part to it. There's always a second part to it with Nikki's assignments. You need to engage in a professional conversation around that particular blog, around that particular resource. So what I want to see happen is a really high quality professional conversation with all of you of a critical nature. And I don't mean by critical to criticise everybody, but to help unpack the philosophy that underpins your choices, to unpack the implications for safe and ethical use, to unpack the implications for this approach to learning. What are the ups? What are the downs? What might be some of the practical considerations you might need to consider? So in here, I want you to ask questions. Use the comment function within the blog to respond to some of the questions. Find somebody else's resource and have a conversation with them about their ideas. Think about giving feedback in terms of what's working well, it would be better if, or have you thought about? Take a critical stance. How might this position the students? How might this represent a particular philosophy about learning and teaching? So engage in that professional conversation. You do not have to respond or contribute to everybody in your class or in the whole cohort. Choose one or two and have a considered conversation with them. I am able to extract all of your contributions to the blog so I can see where you're replying. So I don't want to see somebody saying simply, hey, that's a great idea, and consider that a professional conversation. There's got to be some substance to it. So less is more in terms of the number of other people's resources that you look at within the blog, but a deeper, richer conversation is what we're looking for there. So here's a rather strangely formatted version of the criteria feedback. That's what happens when you try to import a Word document in to explain everything. So we're looking for creativity, originality, and a move towards modification and redefinition. That's from the SAMAR model, which was the subject of one of your online lectures. The resource needs to actually function as it's intended, so it's got to actually work. So make sure that you test that your application actually works or your resource works. And if it requires a specific browser, then make sure you stipulate that in your blog post as well. Clearly and concisely explain the intent of the digital resource. What's its purpose? What's the context? Why have you created it? So that's all about context. How will this engage learners? And here's where you start to bring in relevant literature. And here's where you identify the ethical and safety considerations. So that's around your 600 words. Now, on word count, I am not a stickler for word count, but I wouldn't be happy to mark 1,000, 1,200 words. But if it's 700 or 800 words, I'm not fussed. If it's 500 words and they're really good words, that's okay. Where I do have a problem with people and word limits is where your writing is just stream of consciousness. Concisely and clearly are the emphasis that I'm looking for. In anything that I write multiple drafts to make sure that my message is clear. So that's part of the expectation at master's level, is that you are a good written communicator and that you get your message over with an economy of words, but that economy of words doesn't compromise the clarity of the message. Hope that makes some sense to you. So in your blog post, I want you to actively stimulate and sustain further discussion. So you're the facilitator of the discussion around your own resource. Provide some prompts, questions, and other people coming into your blog post should be also asking questions and providing some encouraging comments. So think about the feedback model. What works well? It would be better if. What are some of the implications or possible implications that you can think of from somebody else's idea? So this is the professional conversation. I'm looking for insightful, original, thoughtful, reflective comments and questions. Okay. And please note, we're expecting by now, this is the second semester of a 2-year program, that you are using APA 6 style correctly. I know that you've had various professional learning opportunities offered to you in the library that Janice has organised, so no excuses for not getting that right at this level. And naturally, your expression, grammar and punctuation is error-free and of a high standard because you're master's students. I hope that provides people with a bit more clarification if needed.